Hello and welcome back. You remember I told you that there are different ways in which you can implement struts to actions? The default way is to have a simple class that has an execute method. And if you've done that, that is a class that does not really implement anything, it does not extend anything. It is just a simple Pojo which has an execute method. So it's kind of like an informal contract because as long as you have an action class, you need to let struts execute it. So struts by default looks at the execute method, and when there's an input request, that's the method that the struts to framework executes. So you can have an action which is a Pojo, but as long as it has an execute method, that should be good. So this is one way in which you can implement struts to actions. The second way is by implementing an action interface. So an action is an interface that's provided in the Struts2 framework. It kind of gets included when you add the jars. So this action interface, it doesn't really have much. The one thing that it does have is the execute method, which is kind of like an informal contract here. But then if you're implementing this interface, you have to have the execute method, otherwise you'll have a compile time error. The other thing that you gain by the action interface is you get some static strings that you can use to return values. So you return a success, or you return a failure, or you return a login, depending on how things go in your execute method. So instead of having hard-coded static values, you can have the static values that you get by implementing the action interface. So again, you don't really gain a lot. So this is not really something you would see often. But then there's a third way in which you can implement struts to actions, which is by extending a class called action support. So this is something we're going to look at in this tutorial. You get a little bit more functionality by doing this rather than by doing this. So this is again another class that comes with the Struts2 framework. What we do is, instead of having a plain Pojo action class, or by an action class implementing the action interface, what we do is we write an action class that extends this action support class. So we'll take a look at what is there in this action support class and what we gain by actually extending this action support class in our Struts2 actions. Okay, so here's my login action. This was earlier implemented as a Pojo, and then I changed this to implement the action interface, which is the second way that we just saw. So we're going to look at the third way, which is extending the action support class. So let me first do that here. I'll remove this and extend this class instead. Okay, so I'm having the same login action. It's extending this action support class now. Okay, so I will import action support from com OpenSymfony xwork 2. Okay, so let's take a look at what this action support class is. Now, if I control click on this, if you have the attached source, you can see the source. If you do not, then this is the way to attach a source. Now, what do you mean by attaching a source? It is just that you tell Eclipse that this is where your source file is so that it can open it up directly. So I click on change attach source, and I give the path where I have the source. So I click on external folder, and here I go to the struts location. There's this src folder which contains the source of struts2, so I'm going to open that and click OK. So now it finds the right source file and it just opens it. So here's our action support class, which we are extending in our login action. If you take a look right away, you can see that the action support in turn implements action. So what we were doing by implementing action is also done by extending an action support. So we are indirectly implementing the action. There are also a few other interfaces that it's implementing. We'll not look at that for now, but we'll come to that in a minute. So the one thing that you should pay attention to is the validate over here. So think about this in our login action. Now let's say before you authenticate a user ID and a password, let's say you want to validate whether the user ID and password is proper or not. One sample validation would be if the user ID is blank, we wouldn't want to proceed with the authentication. You would want to validate it first. And same way for the password. If the password is blank, you wouldn't want to go with the authentication. You would want to first send a message back and say, hey, the user ID is blank or the password is blank, and make the user re-enter. So how would you typically do it if you have just one execute method? You would obviously have an if condition over here where you validate if the user ID is null or the password is null, return to login. Well, that would just take care of the redirection, but then you would also have to display messages saying, hey, the user ID is null or the password is blank or something like that. This is actually made very simple by using the action support. Now notice the action support has a method called validate. Now look at the comments that go above it. So it says it's a default implementation that really validates nothing. Subclasses should override this method to provide validations. So what is a subclass of the action support over here? It is the login action. So what actually we can do is a login action or any of our actions that extends action support can have an implementation of validate, of this validate method that does the actual validation. So there is a validate method in the action support that does nothing, does not validate anything. That validate method can be overridden in our action classes to provide specific validations that's required for our scenario. So in our login action, we can override that validate and do validation for user ID and password. In our tutorial action, we can override that validate and do a validation for the language or whatever inputs that we have. So let's try that out for the user ID and password. We will try to validate that the user ID is not null and the password is not null. When I say null, I mean blank. So I want to make sure that the user has entered something for the user ID and the password. So I will do that by overriding this validate method. I'll just copy and paste this here. Now I can validate that the user ID and password is not blank. So when I write code in the validate again, just like in the execute method, I can assume that the user ID and password is filled with the value that the user has entered. So if the user has entered some value in the user ID text box and some value in the password text box, I can take it for granted that those values will be assigned to these two member variables in my action by the Struts2 framework. So I will do a if the user string utils dot is empty of the user ID, then I have to take care of the user ID being null. And of course, the same thing for the password. Of course, I could use the getter here. Let me actually do that. I do the get user ID. The get password. Okay, so here inside this if, I need to handle the scenario if the user ID is blank. And in this if, I can handle the scenario that the password is blank. Now, how do I do that? I would not only want the control to go back to the login page, I would also want to display some kind of an error message. Let's look at redirecting the flow of control. Now, if it were an execute method, how would I redirect the flow of control? I would return the login string, and then that login would be mapped to... Okay, so that login string would be mapped to login.jsp. So that is how the flow of control would go to the login page in case of an error. But is it possible for me to do that in the validate method? No, it's not possible, because notice this. the return type is a void. The execute had a return type of string, and I could return the string in order to choose the flow. So if I wanted to go to a particular page, I would return the result string, and then that result string would be mapped to the page that I want to redirect to. But in the case of a validate, I cannot do that. I cannot return anything. I cannot do a return login here because the return type is a void. So how do I redirect to the login page? And then the second question is, how do I display the message? So the way it works in Struts 2 is you kind of kill two birds with one stone here. So what you do is you use this particular method in the action support called add field error. So the idea is that the validate here is very likely validating the input fields. So you have some fields in your page, and then the user has entered some values, and they are validating the values that the user has entered. So you can use the add field error method over here in order to pass an error message for a particular field name. I'll just implement this so that you can see what's actually happening here. So in the case of the user ID being blank, what I do is I add a field error. And this add field error takes two parameters that we just saw. It is the field name and the error message. So I will add the field name being user ID. And the validation message would be user ID cannot be blank. And of course I would add a different field error in case of the password being blank, and that would be of course the field name password and password cannot be blank. Okay, so again what we're doing is in case of any condition that you want to catch in your validate, what you can do is you can do a add field error. So this is for field specific error messages. So this if condition is checking if the user ID is blank, and if so, it adds a field error for the field user ID. It adds this error message, the user ID cannot be blank. And of course the same thing for the password. If the password is blank, then you add a field error for the field password, the error message being that the password cannot be blank. Okay, so this is the messaging part. So we have error messaging in place. Okay, so now to the second question. So how do we do a redirect since we cannot really return a string? Well, what's happening in the Struts 2 framework is you don't actually need to do a redirection. What it does is it checks if there are any field errors. It automatically redirects to the page where the data was submitted by the user. And the standard convention in Struts 2 for the input page where the user enters the input data is that you use the string input to denote the result. So what I mean by that is, let's open the login. I actually see that there are two login actions. Let me remove this because this would not work right. Okay, so here I have a login action that has a result mapped for success and a result mapped for login. So the default for an input value for any page, so this is fine for login, but then you could have a different page where you're entering some other set of inputs, where you're asking the user to enter some set of inputs, and then you're validating. You would use the result input as the standard. So let me do that over here as well. I will define input is this result name. So this is by default the indicator to Struts 2 that this is the input form page. So this is where the user actually enters the data that was input to this login action. So once you've done this, Struts 2 takes care of the rest. What Struts 2 does is, before the execute is called, it calls the validate. But of course, before it calls the validate also, it makes sure that these fields are populated like I told you before. So the user ID goes here and the password goes here. Now struts2 calls the validate. The validate method executes. There's not really any return type. So what struts2 does is it checks if this code adds any field errors to any of the fields. Okay, so if there are some field errors added, even if there is one field error that's added, what struts2 does is it by default does not execute the execute method. Instead, it cuts the flow short and instead redirects to the input result. So what is the input result over here? It's the login.jsp. So it's going to automatically redirect to login.jsp. Okay, so let's run this. And there's one other thing that struts2 does. We'll see what that is. Okay, so here's my login page, login.jsp, which will call the login action upon submit. Okay, so when I enter some value over here, test and test. Okay, so when I enter the value over here and I hit submit, what's going to happen is validate is going to get called first, and then it does this validation. All right. So let's hit submit now. Well, there is actually a login error, so it does not go through. So let me enter the right values. User ID and password. Okay, so these are the hard-coded values we had entered in the previous tutorial. Okay, so you're able to proceed. Now, here's the thing. Now, if I do not enter either the login ID or the password, look what happens. I'll leave the password as blank now. Okay, and I'll hit submit. Notice what happens. Not only does struts2 redirect back to the login page, it also adds this field level error message on top of the password field. If you remember, this is this message. So we have added a field error message for the field password, saying that the password cannot be blank after validating if the password is blank or not. So struts2 not only does the redirection, it also displays the field error that we have added over here. So the same thing goes for the user ID. Let's say the user ID is blank. I have something with the password and I hit submit. It says that the user ID cannot be blank, and then adds that message on top of the user ID text box. And of course, it does that for both if required. So both these messages are coming up because both of them were validated in the validate method, and then there were field errors that were added for both the user ID and the password text box. So this is a very handy way in which you can do validation. This is of course a very basic level of validation. We can do much more advanced validation with struts2, but I hope this basic level is I hope this is clear and you can see how helpful it is. You do not have to write code to do all the validation and redirect and display the messages and all that stuff. You just check the member variables, do your validation, and then add field error messages. And struts2 takes care of the rest. It checks the field errors, redirects accordingly, and then displays the field errors on top of the text boxes. Or it is not just the text boxes, any control that you want, as long as your control in the JSP is a struts2 control, it'll work fine. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that if you have the s:\text field, the s:\password, so as long as this is a struts control, it's a s:\control, struts2 knows where to display the message and it takes care of this. And of course, there are ways in which we can format the error messages also. We'll come to that in a subsequent tutorial. But I hope this part is clear. So this is essentially one of the advantages of using the action support class. If you extend the action support class, you get one of the features that you get is the validation. And really what's happening is the action support is implementing a couple of interfaces that handles the validation. So you have validatable and validation aware. So these are the two interfaces that the action support is implementing. You could actually implement these two interfaces and write these methods and not have to extend the action support. But then there are all these interfaces that get added. So not only do you implement the action, you also implement the action support and the validatable and all that stuff. So this is where it's handy to just extend the action support, because you have all these interfaces that are implemented, and then just one class extension is going to give you all these features. So this is a very introductory look at action support and one of the features that it provides. We will revisit the validation in a subsequent tutorial. We're going to look at how this is happening. We're going to look at some behind the scenes flow of how Struts 2 handles this. But for now, I hope these concepts are helpful.